lockdown prompted many complaints to my office, and our subsequent investigation received almost 150. The investigation has now concluded, and my report was tabled in the Victorian Parliament today. The investigation learned that senior health officials agreed at a meeting at 11 a.m. on Saturday, July the 4th, to lock down the towers to contain a worrying outbreak of the virus. The officials expected the lockdown to begin the next day, allowing time to plan supplies of food and other essential supports. But at a press conference at 4 p.m, the Premier announced the lockdown, effective immediately. It was enforced by large numbers of police who were on site before local residents knew what was happening. Documents relating to the lockdown referenced security concerns at the estates. The investigation found little evidence to support these assumptions. The investigation heard that the early days of the lockdown were chaotic. Some people were without food and medications. Their voices are in this report. Their stories are distressing. People at 8 of the 9 towers were detained in their homes for 5 days. Residents of one tower were detained a further 9 days, waiting more than a week to be allowed outside for supervised access to fresh air. This report is not a criticism of the hundreds of public health officials who dealt with the crisis and its huge logistical challenges. Many went above and beyond to support the residents. But like the virus it sought to contain, the immediacy of the lockdown risked the health and well-being of many people. Victoria's expert on infectious diseases, acting as Chief Health Officer that day, told us that although she signed the lockdown directions, the timing was not on her advice, and she had less than 15 minutes to review the directions and their human rights implications. The investigation found that the decision to bring forward the lockdown was very likely made at a cabinet meeting earlier that afternoon. The lockdown successfully stopped the spread of the virus at the towers. But in my opinion, the immediacy of it was not compatible with the residents' human rights, including the right to humane treatment when deprived of liberty. It appears to me to be contrary to Victorian law, specifically the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities Act. The government does not agree the lockdown of the towers was contrary to law or that human rights were breached. Some may be tempted in a crisis to view human rights as expendable to the goal of saving human lives. This thinking can lead to dangerous territory. In a just society, human rights provides the framework for how we will treat and be treated as the crisis unfolds. In this case, proper consideration of human rights would have allowed more time to plan for a more humane operation. The government need not apologise for taking necessary and difficult action to keep us all safe in the face of this pandemic. But the rushed decision to detain 3,000 people immediately did not appear to have been taken on such health advice. Among my recommendations are that the Victorian Government apologise to the people detained at the public housing estates for the harm and distress caused by the immediacy of their lockdown. This apology would mark an important step in restoring community trust and affirm our commitment to the protection of human rights that are for all of us, whatever our state of health or wealth, background or behaviour, wherever we live.
Can you explain how it breached people's human rights?
There is a fundamental human right to humane treatment when you're deprived of liberty. Now, human rights are not absolute. They can be curtailed if it's necessary. I don't suggest that the lockdown as such would have been a contravention of people's human rights. It was the immediacy of that which did not appear to be reasonably necessary. It could have, the expert advice that we had in this investigation was that it would not have made a hugely significant difference. Therefore, there could have been time to plan. That would have mitigated the impact of the lockdown to the point where people would have been able to have supplies of food, have supplies of medication, have an understanding of what was going on. What we found in this case is that, and there are many such stories in the report, that people just saw hordes of police around and had no idea what was going on.
On October 22nd, the newly appointed Secretary of Premier and Cabinet wrote you a letter denying you access to the Cabinet documents. This is not the first investigation that you've had denials of these kinds of documents. Do you think it's time for, I guess, all commissioners and ombudsmen to be allowed a little bit more access to these kinds of documents?
That's a matter for Parliament. I mean, they are entitled to deny me access. I need to make that really clear. Obviously, I'd like to have the information, and people in my position always find it frustrating when we don't have access to the information we'd like to receive. Privileges is a complicated area, and it does depend on what particular powers I'm exercising in the course of my investigations. But I think, like anybody in my position, it is always better to have more information than less.
What were the provisions that allowed them to hand up the documents to the inquiry but not to you?
It was voluntary. They chose to hand them to the inquiry. They could have waived the privilege to me, but they chose not to.
Was there a particular story that stood out to you as being, I guess, particularly troubling in this whole situation, and perhaps an illustration of somebody's human rights being breached?
Many of these people came from war-torn and deeply troubled backgrounds. There are many refugees living in those towers, people who came from war-torn states where they had been tortured at the hands of their states. You know, the sight of police surrounding the buildings, government officials knocking at the door, unexpected, was deeply traumatising, I think, for some of the people we spoke to.
And what did people at Alfred Street make of the temporary fencing when they were finally let out for a fresh air break?
Degrading, inhumane, and that's one of the findings I make in this report. They acknowledged the mistake very quickly, I have to say, and they pulled it down very quickly. But it was appalling. I mean, it was an appalling look, and those who went out there expressed the view that led very clearly to a finding that it was degrading.
There's some common ground in your report and others that have reported recently, particularly the need for a surge capacity in caring, if you like, during times of crisis. But there's also some common ground in observations on how the public service is working. The fact that decision-making seems to be fairly opaque. Would you like to comment more generally on that?
We looked at the decision-making very carefully in this, and I think we were able to determine it as far as we were able to on the information available to us. I don't make broader observations around decision-making in the public sector. I think the evidence in this case speaks for itself. There was a control agency in charge. It was the Department of Health and Human Services. But clearly mistakes were made, and those mistakes, I have to say, have to a large extent been acknowledged.
The DHHS has been described elsewhere by the AMA, or former president, I think, of the AMA, as defensive, and I have to say their response in the report here also fits that description in my view. Do you have any comment on that?
I think I'll let the evidence speak for itself in that case.
One of the recommendations is to allow a person subject to detention to seek a review of the decision. How would that help someone?
There is already a requirement in the Act that detention must be reviewed. It is actually already, it is present. There are very few legislative controls in place on arbitrary detention. And bear in mind that what we're talking about here is people being deprived of liberty. The main control against arbitrary detention is a requirement that detention be reviewed. And it didn't, in fact, happen in this case.
Considering that you've made the decision yourself that this is contrary to law, does this kind of pave the way for people within the towers to claim compensation or take some kind of legal action against the government?
I'm not a court, and I have to be very clear about that. This is my opinion. I can express an opinion. The government does not agree with my opinion. What was very important for me, the purpose of this, was to shine a light on what was a very dark episode in our recent history. What happens next, I think, is a matter for others.
If the government had waited until the next day to impose the lockdown, do you think there would have been a need for an investigation?
Well, bearing in mind that the fundamental aspect of it that led to the finding is its immediacy, I think that probably answers your question. There would have been time to prepare, at least to some degree, to mitigate the effects. And I think if that had happened, we simply wouldn't have had the complaints we saw. I don't think we would have seen the scenes we saw of the distress. I mean, they flashed around our television screens, they flashed around the world.
Why do you consider that it might have been required to put the towers into a harsher lockdown than the rest of Melbourne ever endured?
This is not what I think. I mean, this is based on public health advice, and certainly public health officials were closely monitoring the situation very closely. But I don't dispute that there was a necessity because of the prevalence of COVID in the towers for an intervention. So I'm not saying that that a lockdown per se would have had the same response.